everyone! I'm Rebecca and welcome back to my channel. About a month ago, I made a video that looked at 100 years of underwear on a plus-size body and how it caused silhouettes to change over time. In that video, which is linked down in the description, I promised that in a follow-up video, I would show you what the full ensemble for each era looks like. And this is that follow-up video. We are going to start in the early 1820s and go all the way through the 19-teens, looking at how the silhouette changed for each era and how the undergarments and the outer clothing worked together to evolve the popular silhouette with the passing years. As with the previous video, one note here, to make filming this easier on myself, I did not do my hair for any of these outfits, and I will not be wearing any accessories such as shoes, hats, jewelry, etc. I will, however, try to pop up pictures of each of these ensembles in their final state, accessories, hair, and all. Now, onto our silhouette timeline. In the 1820s, the columnar look was in. The corset did not take in the waist here because why would it? The dresses didn't provide an opportunity to show off a tiny waist. The fitted part of the dress was just below the bust, so the corset created a shelf bust look and the skirts hung straight down below that. As opposed to earlier in the Regency period when dresses were often very light and lithe, in the 1820s the hems of the dresses begin to stand out. First, with decorations such as puffs or ruffles, and eventually with stiffeners such as corded hems. This dress is made of lightweight navy Swiss dot cotton with a gathered bodice and drawstring closures in the back. The puffed sleeves were inspired by this portrait from the era. I made this in 2016 and the pattern for this dress is a combination of diagrams from Period Costume for Stage and Screen by Jean Honeysett and from Patterns of Fashion by Janet Arnold, though the puffs around the hem were just me wanting to play with that 1820s style. Besides the aforementioned undergarments, it is also worn over a chemisette, which is a lightweight garment basically made of squares of fabric set on drawstrings, but with an elaborate ruffled collar that showed above the necklines of the Regency dresses, making them more appropriate as day wear. As the 1820s progressed, the skirts got stiffer, fuller, and shorter. Sleeves became larger, and the bodice waist dropped lower, all of which created a need for new petticoats. Plus sleeve plumbers to hold out the sleeves. Enter the oh-so-sweet and silly silhouette of the 1830s. For a full rundown of these transitional 1830s fashions, please do check out my 1830s video, which I have linked up above and down below in the description. This dress is actually the first 1830s dress I ever made, back in 2015, and to be honest, the main reason I chose to wear it for this video is because it is my only front-closing 1830s dress. As you will see throughout this video, getting into or out of a back-closing dress when you live alone is really quite a challenge. Also, I haven't worn this dress in several years and I'm still super happy with it, so I figured it needed some more love. Although it may not look it, this dress is actually sportswear and was designed for archery. It also happens to be one of the first fashion plates I ever recreated. It is a copy of this fashion plate from La Belle Assemblée from autumn 1831. Check out the link to this plate in the description for a full detailed breakdown of the ensembles in this plate. Really, this was most likely worn over a similar chemisette to the one I wore with the Regency outfit, but at the time I made this, I don't think I actually knew those existed, so this has a built-in ruffled collar. And I have even gotten to wear this to do actual archery. It has a highly decorated puffed sleeve bodice, separate skirt pleated into its own waistband, and a matching belt. When I made this, I even painted shoes to match, like in the fashion plate. It's worn over a corded petticoat, plus another starched petticoat with a single ruffle around the hem, which you will probably recognize from my undergarment hacks video, which I will link down below. As the 1830s continued, the sleeves became smaller and closer fitting, skirts became longer and fuller, and the waistline dropped lower. So, as we move into the 1840s, new undergarments are required to help fill out this dress shape. We're piling on the petticoats here to fill out the skirts, adding a multi-tiered ruffled petticoat to the corded petticoat, and I've switched to a corset much more similar to what we think of today as a Victorian corset. Though, full disclosure, I actually wear this dress with an 1860s corset since I do not yet have a proper 1840s corset. The 1840s was still fully embracing the back closure, so this is my best attempt at putting this dress on, which honestly was much more successful than when I tried to take this dress off afterwards, as you will see. I made this dress in 2019 and is based on McCall's pattern 7988, which is designed by Angela Clayton, though I have made many changes to the pattern. Also, I made little improvements to this dress each of the first 3 times that I wore it. The first time, it had short sleeves, similar to the look of the pattern. The second time, I hastily made some very ill-fitting long sleeves. And the third time, I had fixed the fit of the long sleeves and made a matching pelerine capelet to go with it, which was a very popular accessory for the 1840s. So while I've been doing this, I have been filming little reels for Instagram too, and doing the undressing and stuff for Instagram, and I definitely just got stuck in that dress. And I forgot that that happened last time, that I was wearing that dress too, and only did up the top hooks and the waist hook. I need to remember not to put that dress on when I'm by myself. This is hard. Moving from the 1840s to the 1850s, besides the skirts getting even larger, since after all 1856 was when the cage crinoline was patented, the bodices also tend to look a bit shorter than they did in the 1840s. This is because the long, slim waists of the 1840s raise up to more of a natural waist in the 1850s. Bodices could be pointed at the center front waist, especially for evening wear, but bodices with peplums or waists that ran straight across were also very popular. And the latter is what I have here, as this blousey sheer bodice actually tucks into the skirt, though commonly this style would have more than likely been connected at the waist instead of being 2 separate pieces. It's kind of fun to compare the sleeves of this bodice to those of the 1840s dress, since they both have very similar ruffles at the top, but here the sleeve has opened into a large gathered lower sleeve. Sleeves in general did get a lot larger in the 1850s than they had been in the 1840s, and the most popular 50s style was actually the pagoda sleeve, which opened into a large sort of bell and would have had tied-in false sleeves that filled in the wide opening of the pagoda sleeve. This dress, though, is an example of a sheer dress, and in fact, this was made out of some very inexpensive poly fabric meant for window shears. Because of the sheerness, the bodice has a built-in fitted liner that covers the undergarments, and the skirt is worn over a solid petticoat, in addition to the petticoats I was wearing previously. This dress can also be worn over a small cage crinoline, which makes it work really nicely for both the early 1850s and also the later 1850s. Honestly, this is such an easy to wear, light and breezy outfit, and it is so perfect for a stroll in a garden or a walk on the beach. I made this dress in 2016 using Simplicity 4551 as a starting point, though it was highly altered from that original pattern. It's a pretty easy transition from the 1850s to the 1860s. The skirts move from a round shape to an elliptical one. The waist raises just slightly, and the bodices and sleeves tend to become more fitted. I've only made 2 outfits from the 1860s, and as one of them is not only back lacing, but also enormous since it is my giant turquoise ball gown, for the ease of getting dressed myself, I decided to pull out one of my earliest costumes. It's not really historically accurate, but the shape is there. This is an example of the very late 1860s, just before things start to transition to the early bustle period. And I made this lovely pink candy-striped ensemble back in 2012, and I wore it a whopping 1 time to costume college that year. I used pattern diagrams from period costume for stage and screen to make the ensemble. And honestly, more than anything else, I was amazed that this even still fit, considering it was also made to go over a totally different corset. The undergarments here include an elliptical cage crinoline, hinting at the future where it will change into a crinolette and then to a bustle. Over that is a petticoat to smooth the hoop lines, and then the outer ensemble consists of 4 pieces, 5 if you include the sash. Though, historically speaking, it probably would have only been 2 to 3 pieces. We have the underbodice, which is kind of like a fitted blouse, the underskirt, which is made out of the same white linen as the underbodice, with lots of wrinkly ruffles around the hem, because I didn't steam this, and an overbodice and overskirt made of the same pink striped fabric. These last 2 pieces almost certainly would have been connected at the waist, acting like a sort of pinafore worn over the base dress. The joins at the waist in mine, though, are hidden with the sash, so I'm calling it good. From the late 1860s, it is a very brief transition to the next silhouette shape of the early 1870s. The waist is still quite high here, though the pointed bodice front does visually lengthen it a little bit, and because of that, I have changed the corset out to an 1870s one that smooths the tummy more than my 1860s one did. The skirts are now supported by a crinolette, or, in my case, my Franken crinolette. So the overall shape is smaller than it was in the 1860s, and pushed much more towards the back. The biggest, most obvious difference here, besides the fact that my sewing skills greatly improved in the 8 years between making these 2 outfits, is that in the 1870s, they basically followed the mantra that more is more when it comes to trimming. More pleats, ruffles, bows, trims on top of trims on top of trims. This idea lasted for pretty much the entire bustle period, though it did tone down a little bit in the 1880s. In fact, I came across a question that someone had posed recently in a costuming Facebook group about what era requires the most fabric, and honestly, I'm pretty sure it's the 1870s. You could easily use 15 yards of fabric, not including linings and such, and still feel like your dress is lacking something. This dress consists of the bodice, underskirt, and overskirt, and if you'd like to learn more about the making of it, I have linked a video about it down below in the description since I made this in March of last year. But for now, let's move on to later in the first bustle era to the mid-1870s. The skirts have now narrowed out so that all of the volume is going towards the back instead of the back and sides. These dresses were still highly trimmed. This dress is a copy of this fashion plate from La Dresse Elegante in 1877, though interestingly, it has a skirt shape that is a bit more like 1875 in my opinion, rather than the late 1870s, since by the late 1870s, the bustle itself had largely disappeared. This is worn over a lobster tail bustle and ruffled petticoat. This dress was maybe my first real engineering challenge because when I made this in 2015, there were no patterns that existed for anything like this bodice or even like the overskirt, so they were both quite a puzzle to figure out. This dress is a great example of how the 1870s loved to pull ideas from historical fashion, since this bodice is heavily inspired by the 1770s and 80s, with the sort of zone front bodice and the super complicated sleeves almost look like something out of the Renaissance. As the 1870s progressed, the large lobster tail bustle diminished, and by the late 1870s, we are in the natural form era. Except, as I've mentioned in some previous videos, there really wasn't anything natural about natural form fashions. While for some dresses in this era, train-supporting hoops were still worn, I'm just wearing a bum pad under my petticoat, and my petticoat is gathered together in the back to help give more bulk under the back of the skirts and decrease the bulk around the sides and front. This dress is heavily inspired by this fashion plate from 1879, and I made this in 2019 for the Costume College Gala. It is still my only natural form dress, which honestly I really need to remedy. I had thought, prior to making this dress, that natural form styles would be quite unflattering to wear since everything is so fitted, but I must say, this dress actually feels very glamorous and flattering. My one reluctance to the natural form now is that they just aren't that practical. High fashion dresses of this era took those heavily embellished bustle skirts, removed the skirt supports, and just made the trains even longer. So you wind up with a lot of nice silk fabric just dragging behind you on the ground, which is not a great idea when your event is outside. This gown is an example of a princess style gown, meaning that it is cut all in one with no waist seam, or at least no seam until you get to mid-thigh in this dress's case. I made this by basically just lengthening my standard Victorian bodice block until it hit mid-thigh, and then doing a lot of fittings until I got something that worked. And I'm quite pleased with the result. However, most dresses of this era did still consist of at least a bodice and skirt and sometimes overskirt, so the princess dress was still a bit of an anomaly at the time. Around 1882 to 1883, fashionable people seemed to decide that they had had enough with all of these silly trains dragging on the floor, and the wired bustle came back and with a vengeance. Bustles of the 1880s were larger and more shelf-like than those of the 1870s. So when I do 1880s, I wear a bustle pad on top of my lobster tail bustle for extra oomph. I also like wearing a quilted petticoat if it's not too hot out, because it helps to really maintain that shelf-like shape. The skirt trimming toned down a little bit in the 1880s, but they were still a really big fan of tailored-looking trims, such as pleats, and other trims that could give a nice sharp line. They also loved asymmetry. Generally speaking, I would say the 1870s was all romantic fluffiness, while the 1880s was more sporty and looked nice and sharp. If you've been around my channel since the beginning of this year, you will definitely recognize this dress. This is my new stripy seaside bustle, and I will link a playlist with all of the making of videos down in the description below. It consists of a pleated underskirt, an overskirt, also trimmed with pleats, and a bodice, all of them accented with velvet ribbon. We are now nearing the end of the Victorian era, with just one style decade to go, the 1890s. In the 1890s, the bustle again disappears, but this time the skirts widen out all around the hem, and stiffening is added directly into the skirts, and into the sleeves for that matter. There's a surprising amount of structural engineering built right into an 1890s skirt, such as hems stiffened with horsehair, tarlatan, velvet, etc., and additional facings and interlinings. Plus, multiple petticoats would be used to help the skirts maintain their shape. The small puffed sleeves that began to be popular in the very late 1880s turned into a giant monster of a sleeve by the mid-1890s. Unlike the 1830s, when separate sleeve plumpers were used to create that shape, in the 1890s, crinoline netting and other stiffeners were usually built right into the sleeve, though a sort of cage-like sleeve support did also exist, but I don't know how often it was actually used. I have made 3 1890s ensembles, but as one doesn't fit with my new corset, and one is just a shirtwaist and skirt combo, I figured that neither of those are really that great of options for this video, so instead, here is the gala gown that I made in 2018 for Costume College, which, while lovely, is yet another back-closing bodice. Because of all of that skirt structure, in combination with the size of the train on this gown, this is also one of my heaviest gowns. But it does sparkle nicely. This is a skirt and bodice combo, worn over a small bum pad and trained petticoat. The same bum pad and petticoat that I wear under the natural form gown, in fact. Though this time, the petticoat has been released so that the shape flows evenly all around as opposed to being all gathered towards the back. 1890s evening dresses were incredibly detailed and were often highly embroidered, beaded, and embellished with very fine details and made out of exquisite fabrics. Since I don't have the patience to hand embroider a gown and don't have access to those exquisite fabrics, mine is plain silk taffeta embellished with sequined appliques, which I hand sewed onto the gown instead. Still, a very time-consuming process. From the 1890s to the beginning of the Edwardian era, the changes are fairly gradual. The main idea here is that everything sort of softens. Sleeves lose their giant size and structure and become soft gathered things. The bodices, too, are gathered into a sort of pigeon-breasted shape, aided by the switch to an S-bend or flat-fronted corset. A ruffly corset cover helps to fill out and create this ideal shape. Skirts become narrower at the hips before flaring out at the bottom. Overall, mainstream fashion here is all about a soft and feminine look that really embraces and enhances a curvy silhouette. This is a jumper dress and shirtwaist blouse combo that I made last spring, and I will link my making of video down in the description. It is worn over my S-bend corset, which I also made last year, a hip pad, the same petticoat that I wore in the 1890s, but this time without the train extension, and the ruffly corset cover. The jumper dress look was extremely popular in this era, probably because it elevated the shirtwaist and skirt combo to something more like actual fashion. Lace trim was pretty much a requirement for Edwardian fashion, and insertion lace in particular became super popular. This extremely delicate, floofy, curvy look did not last forever though. The fashionable silhouette became longer and slimmer by around in 1908 to 1909, and by the early 19-teens, the slim shape was in. Not that curves were out, but now it wasn't all about that small waist, large bust look like it had been previously. In the 19-teens, the corset shape changed again, and now, like the Regency corset, the aim was no longer taking in the waist, but instead was used to smooth the entire torso from under the bust all the way down past the hips. The dresses of this era fit much tighter to the body, even over the hips, and the popular waistline was just about at an empire level. In fact, much of the early 19-teens fashion draws heavily on Regency fashion as an inspiration, which really brings this 100-year video full circle. As they say, everything old is new again. I am wearing a dress from approximately 1912 that I made last summer, which kind of began its life as Butterick 6093 before I completely hacked that pattern to bits and wound up with something really quite different. If you want to learn more about all of the changes that I made, I will link the first vlog for this dress down below. This dress is worn over a long-lying teens era corset, a modern bra and camisole, and a princess slip, which was sort of a combo of a corset cover and petticoat that made it so you didn't have to have any extra bulk at the waist, helping to maintain those smooth lines. And just like that, we have finished our 100-year tour. Here is a quick look at what all of those silhouettes look like all together. I think that when you see them side by side, you can pretty easily see how one look naturally evolved out of the one before it, creating a really neat look at the cycle of fashionable silhouettes. Thank you all so much for joining me for this look at 100 years of plus-size fashion. This was just a small glance at some of the ensembles I've made over my 11 or so years of historical costuming, and I've been thinking about making a video about my costuming journey, which would take a super quick look at all of the historical costumes I have ever made. If that is something that you would be interested in, please let me know, and also let me know if you would want me to include any of the cosplay costumes that I've made for myself, just because it might be an interesting look at how skills change over time with more practice. Anyway, if you liked this video, please go ahead and click the thumbs up icon, and if you'd like to see more videos like this from me, please go ahead and click subscribe and the little bell icon to be notified every time I post a new video. I do post videos here on YouTube twice a week, with my sewing vlogs on Tuesdays and other costuming content like this out on Saturdays, but I post every day over on my Instagram, so please go follow me on Instagram. That's @LadyRebeccaFashions. And if you'd like to help support all of the work that I do on this channel, I do have a link to my Patreon and my Ko-fi account down below. I'd also like to give a special shout out to my Edwardian level patrons, Heidi and Sharon. Thank you all so much for joining me for this video. Have a wonderful week, and I will see you very soon in my next video.